Hello all. So I'm going to talk about making the book cover for the size that we chose. Should be able to make it with just one piece of chipboard and one piece of scrap paper. So first thing we need to do is cut our chipboard down to size. To do that, we need to take a look at the size of our signatures, which are right at 6 inches long. So I want to go ahead and cut the chipboard to 6 1/4 so that it hangs over about 1/8 inch on either side. Now that this is measured out, I'm going to go ahead and cut it. If you wanted to, you could go and just take your ruler and run an X-Acto knife down the line, or a utility knife, whatever sort of a blade you have. If you have a cutter like this, these are a little bit lightweight to cut through the chipboard. I have a more industrial cutter, so I'm going to use that off camera. Okay, so there is our first cut. Next step to this, we want to look at the width of our signatures. I've actually measured these and I know that they're right at about 4.5 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the chipboard to 4.5 inches. I like my chipboard to about match the size of my signatures. And given the size that we're using, this centerpiece is actually going to be just about perfect for our spine. We'll have to trim it just a little bit, but we'll go through that in a minute. Okay, there are 3 pieces, and we're going to go ahead and cut down our center spine a bit. So there are our boards. Now what we're going to want to do, go ahead and lay them out on the wrong side of the paper. Now, especially when I'm as close on the dimensions as this, I prefer to go ahead and measure everything out and strike my lines ahead of time. So I'm going to do that now. So what I've done, I knew the size. This is 12 inches. The size of my book boards are 6 1/4. So I have 3 inches on one side and 2 3/4 on the other side. Means that each of these should just about perfectly fit right along the line. I also gave myself a center point for this. So I'm going to measure that out now. All right, so what I've done, I knew this was 1.5 inches, which means that the bounds should be 3/4 of an inch on either side. So I have that, and then I added the 1/4 inch on either side of that to set my book board. You need to leave about 1/4 inch is usually pretty good, but you need to leave some space between the center part, or you need to leave the space in between to act as kind of a hinge for where the book opens and closes. Now what we're going to do is we go ahead and we glue these pieces down. So for glue, when we're doing these big flat surfaces that aren't moving, so I like them for book covers, for things like that, where it doesn't have to be flexible. It just has to be kind of an even spread and holding. I pretty frequently will use a spray adhesive. This is the acid-free craft bond, and I'll go outside and spray this down kind of one board at a time, and I place each board sort of consecutively. So I'll go ahead and do that now. All right, so I have the one side sprayed down. We're going to go ahead and lay this right in place and just sort of press it down. Now that stuff, it gets all over the place. It's a spray adhesive. If you have a place in your house that you can spray it well, that's well ventilated, maybe you do it inside. I always just kind of take it out and work on my patio. But you can see we have that first bit down. So I'll go ahead and get my next side. Okay, so we have our 3 boards glued in place. So now what we have to do is cut the ears into our paper and fold it over. So just to show you how that works, you don't actually have to measure for this, but I do. Really, it's a matter of preference. So what I've measured out is actually just 1/4 inch inset from either side. This is mainly for me as a guide. It's not a necessary step, but I like to do it, and I like to make sure that all of my corners are the same. Most of the tutorials you'll see will have just kind of cutting a generic shape. I like to measure. You'll notice when I'm drawing the lines, I do stay about 1/8 of an inch off the corner. That's just, we want that little extra bit for when we fold the paper over. Okay, now we'll go ahead and cut the corners out. Okay, now that we have these corners cut out, we can work on folding the paper over. You can use a bone folder if you like, just to help give you a little bit better edge. Okay, so I have everything laid out or folded up. Now you'll notice these sides are pretty tight. I wouldn't want to go any smaller than this, and I usually like to keep them actually a bit longer. But by the time we get these folded in and glued down, they'll be nice and secure, so I won't worry too much about them. Okay, so to glue down these flaps, we're going to use a different glue, mainly because I don't want to spray and get anything on the finished surfaces. So we're just using craft bond glue again. And the way this will work, I'm going to glue down my small flaps first. Just going to put a bead of glue, and then we're going to brush it so that it's nice and consistent across the whole flap. Now it's important to get consistent coverage on the thing, but you don't actually need, you don't want too much. So this is a nice way to do it with just kind of a spare brush that you have. It gives you a nice consistent top, but doesn't, you'll end up brushing off a lot of the excess, which is what you want. So once we have the glue applied, we'll go ahead and fold it into place. And use a bone folder to smooth it down. Now we're going to flip it around and do the same thing to the other side. So you might end up with little dimples on the sides, especially if you make your slopes as tight as I did. And you can usually just fix that with a dollop of glue and then kind of bend the paper into itself. Okay. Now, last thing to notice is I'm going to go ahead and in the grooves here, I'm just going to pinch the paper together. So all I'm going to do is while the glue's still wet, I want to go ahead and pinch down the paper in the creases here. So the next thing we have to do, obviously, we need to do our inside lining. Make sure that we cover up this bit. So for that, we're just choosing a bit of craft paper. Now again, because we kind of specifically chose our dimensions here, this craft paper matches up almost perfectly with the width. So I'm not going to need to trim any off of the length of it. And all I'm going to want to do is measure and trim down. What you want to do is trim it so that it fits inside and covers all of your seams and the inside of it, but you don't want it to go into the bend. So try to stay about at least an 1/8 inch off the edges. Depending on how much buffer you have, you can really choose. That's sort of up to you how far off the edge you want to go. I'm going to try to go nice and tight to it and keep it as close as I can. So we're at pretty close, a little bit over 6 1/4. So subtract 1/4 inch from this and it'll be perfect. Now to do just kind of a test fit. Just about like that, and that's how we want it. All right, so what I have found over some testing is, as much as I'd like to use the spray glue on this, it really kind of soaks through the paper. Works really well on the chipboard, but spraying directly to this craft paper is really not good. So we're going to go ahead the same way we did the flaps, apply glue on it, and then use the just craft bond glue, and then we're going to spread it out nice and even with a brush.
Big spot right there that doesn't have any glue.
Okay, so now that I had the glue down and in place, I'm going ahead and carefully applying it to the inside of the book. In the same way that I did with the cover sheet, I'm going to go ahead and pinch down the insides to try to get that contact there on the hinge. Okay. Okay, so that is the finished cover. What we're going to go ahead and do now is you want to put a book on this and let it dry for at least a few hours, depending on what glue you use. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. With the craft paper, it's not as important, but especially if you use a lighter weight liner, if you don't apply pressure while it's drying, you're going to end up getting a lot of ripples in the paper, and we really want to avoid that. All right, so as I mentioned before, we were going to press this with books, finding the biggest heavy college textbooks I had. We have it pressed, and you can see that this is our book cover.